Today, we will be looking at two horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. The first one in particular is devastating. 20 minutes. That's how long it took for a Sunday morning adventure to become a race against death, with two teenagers buried alive. The second story is even more terrifying, as overambition led towards an unimaginable tragedy. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On May 24th, 1987, four friends drove to Lava Beds National Monument, just south of Klamath Falls, Oregon, with plans to explore the area's famous cave systems. Kevin Smith and his brother Mike were experienced cavers who had been exploring underground passages for over a year. They were joined by Kevin Atkinson, 16 years old, and John Adams, who at 14 was the youngest member of the group. The monument encourages cave exploration, with numerous ungated lava caves open to both tourists and serious cavers. Unlike many cave systems that require special permits or guided tours, Lava Beds allows visitors to explore on their own, though they must sign in at trail registers before entering certain areas. The group arrived at the Skull Cave parking lot around 10 a.m. on that Sunday morning. Skull Cave was one of the monument's most popular destinations, a large lava tube that extends deep into the volcanic rock. The cave's name comes from the animal bones found at its entrance, remnants of creatures that fell into the opening and could not escape. The group split up to explore different areas. Kevin and Mike Smith decided to enter Skull Cave itself, while Atkinson and Adams chose to investigate a collapse hole located a short distance from the Wilderness Trail, just beyond the trail register. The collapse hole that caught Atkinson and Adams' attention was typical of the volcanic landscape. When lava tubes cool and age, sections of the ceiling sometimes fall in, creating openings to the surface and piles of broken rock called breakdown. These areas can be fascinating to explore, but they are also inherently unstable. Around 10 a.m., Kevin Atkinson discovered what appeared to be an opening leading down into the pile of volcanic rock. The hole seemed to lead to a small chamber below the breakdown. Despite the obvious instability of the loose rocks around him, Atkinson decided to climb down through the opening to explore the chamber below. John Adams remained at the surface level, clambering around the edges of the collapse hole and examining the rock formations. The 14-year-old was fascinated by the volcanic landscape and moved carefully among the loose stones, unaware of the danger building beneath his feet. The volcanic rock in breakdown piles creates a delicate balance. Each piece of stone may be supporting others above it, creating an unstable house of cards that can collapse without warning. Even rocks that seem solid can shift when disturbed, causing a cascade of falling stone that can trap or crush anyone below. As Adams moved around the hole, the pressure and vibration from his movements began to affect the already unstable rock pile. The sides of the collapse started to shift and crumble. Within moments, the breakdown gave way in a thunderous cascade of volcanic stone. The rockfall happened with terrifying speed. Chunks of lava rock, some weighing hundreds of pounds, tumbled into the hole where Atkinson was exploring. Adams, caught on the walls of the hole leading to the chamber when the sides gave way, was also trapped as rocks fell around and on top of him. In an instant, both teenagers found themselves buried under tons of volcanic stone. Atkinson was trapped in the small chamber below, with rocks blocking his escape route to the surface. Adams was buried some distance below the surface level, with heavy stones pinning his body and limiting his movement. The collapse created a deadly situation. Not only were both boys trapped and potentially injured, but any attempt to move the rocks could trigger another collapse, burying them deeper or crushing them completely. The breakdown pile was now even more unstable than before, with loose rocks balanced precariously above the trapped teenagers. From beneath the pile of stone, the boys began calling for help. Their voices echoed strangely through the spaces between the rocks, making it difficult to determine exactly where they were located. Atkinson reported numbness in his extremities, suggesting possible nerve damage or a crushed leg. Adams was conscious but in shock, trapped and unable to move under the weight of the volcanic rock. Kevin and Mike Smith emerged from Skull Cave to find their companions missing. They walked to the trail register, expecting to find Atkinson and Adams waiting for them or signing in for their own cave exploration. Instead, they heard yelling coming from the direction of the collapse hole. Rushing to the source of the voices, the Smith brothers quickly realized what had happened. They could hear their friends calling from beneath the pile of rocks, but the extent of the collapse made it clear that this was far beyond anything they could handle on their own. Kevin Smith immediately ran for the visitor center at Indian Wells headquarters. At 10:20 a.m., just 20 minutes after the collapse, he reported the incident to park personnel. His quick thinking and rapid response would prove crucial in organizing the complex rescue operation that followed. Park Service personnel responded immediately to the emergency. When they arrived at the collapse site, they quickly assessed the situation. 2 teenagers trapped under tons of unstable volcanic rock, with at least one reporting possible serious injury. It was clear that this would require a major rescue operation involving specialized equipment and personnel. The Park Service requested assistance from multiple agencies. The California Highway Patrol and Sheriff's Office were contacted, along with an ambulance and fire engine from the nearby town of Tula Lake. By fortunate coincidence, 4 well-equipped spelunkers from the San Francisco Bay chapter of the National Speleological Society were visiting the monument that day. These experienced cave explorers immediately volunteered their assistance and expertise, providing crucial knowledge about cave rescue techniques and rock stabilization. At 10:45 a.m., just 25 minutes after the initial report, a helicopter was requested in case rapid medical evacuation became necessary. The nearest available aircraft was a California Department of Forestry helicopter stationed in Bieber. The aircraft, designated CDF Copter 202, was dispatched immediately to the scene. As rescue personnel began arriving at lava beds, the complexity of the operation became clear. They had to first rescue Atkinson since he was trapped in a chamber under the breakdown. Any instability or breakdowns while rescuing Adam could create a fatal situation for Atkinson. The Skull Cave parking lot was cleared of all vehicles to create a landing zone for the incoming helicopter. Every car had to be moved to make room for the aircraft that might be needed to transport critically injured victims to medical facilities. CDF Copter 202 arrived at 11:30 a.m., bringing additional medical personnel to the scene. An emergency medical technician from the helicopter crew positioned herself near the collapse site, where she could communicate directly with John Adams. Her primary role was to keep the trapped teenager's morale up and monitor his condition while the rescue operation proceeded. Moving the rocks that trapped Atkinson and Adams required extreme care and considerable risk. Each stone had to be evaluated before being moved, as shifting the wrong rock could trigger another collapse that would bury the victims deeper or trap the rescuers as well. Park Service personnel placed themselves in extremely hazardous positions to stabilize the collapse area. The walls of the hole were braced with wooden supports to prevent further cave-ins. One rescuer climbed down into the unstable breakdown pile to take precise measurements of the spaces between rocks and the positioning of the trapped teenagers. The measurements were passed up to personnel on the surface, who used chainsaws to cut wooden braces to the exact required lengths. These supports were then passed back down into the hole and hammered into place to hold back the loose rock. Hydraulic jacks were also used to create stable spaces where rescuers could work safely. The process was painstakingly slow. Every movement had to be calculated and deliberate. The volcanic rock was sharp and difficult to handle, and the constant threat of another collapse made every action potentially life-threatening for both the victims and their rescuers. As the walls were gradually stabilized, rescuers were able to bring in a porta-power hydraulic device to move the larger rocks that were directly trapping the teenagers. This powerful tool could lift stones that were too heavy for human strength alone, but it had to be positioned carefully to avoid destabilizing other parts of the breakdown pile. After nearly 3 hours of careful, dangerous work, rescuers achieved their first success. At 12:55 p.m., Kevin Atkinson was freed from the rocks that had trapped him in the small chamber below ground. He had been buried for almost 3 hours, but his injuries were less severe than initially feared. Atkinson appeared to be suffering from shock, which was expected given his ordeal, but examination revealed only minor abrasions and cuts from the sharp volcanic rock. There were no broken bones or signs of the serious leg injury that had been feared based on his reports of numbness. The 16-year-old was immediately placed on a backboard and carefully removed from the unstable collapse area. At 1 p.m., just 5 minutes after being freed, he was loaded onto CDF Copter 202 and flown to Merle West Medical Center in Klamath Falls, Oregon, for comprehensive medical evaluation and treatment. Even with Atkinson safely rescued, the operation remained extremely dangerous. John Adams was still trapped under the rocks, and the rescue work had made the breakdown pile even more unstable. Every rock that had been moved had potentially shifted the balance of the remaining stones. At 1:15 p.m., Lassen County rescue personnel were placed on standby in case the collapse area gave way again and trapped some of the rescuers. The rescuers were working in conditions where a single wrong move could bury them alongside the victim they were trying to save. The decision to continue the rescue despite the increasing danger demonstrated the commitment of the Park Service personnel and other rescuers. They could have waited for additional equipment or tried to approach the problem differently, but Adams had already been trapped for over 3 hours, and delay could prove fatal. The methodical work continued, with rescuers carefully removing rocks and stabilizing the breakdown pile piece by piece. The Porta-Power hydraulic device proved essential in moving the heaviest stones that were pinning Adams to the ground. At 2 p.m., nearly 4 hours after the initial collapse, John Adams was finally freed from the volcanic rock that had trapped him. Like Atkinson, the 14-year-old was suffering from shock but had avoided serious injury. Adams was immediately placed on a backboard and removed from the dangerous collapse area. He was then loaded onto the waiting helicopter and flown to the same medical facility in Klamath Falls where Atkinson was being treated. Both teenagers would make full recoveries from their ordeal. In this next story, the spelunkers weren't as lucky as the first ones. On May 27, 2008, experienced caver Steve Gladieux prepared to lead what should have been a routine through trip in the Sloan Valley cave system. The plan was straightforward: enter through the post office entrance at 11 a.m. and emerge at the garbage pit entrance by 6 p.m., guiding 8 novice cavers through one of the region's most spectacular underground routes. When morning came, 2 novices admitted they were too exhausted to tackle the challenging cave system safely. Steve made the responsible decision to leave them at the surface, reducing his group to 7 inexperienced cavers who were about to face conditions that would test every limit of their endurance. At 11 a.m. sharp, Steve led his team into the 25-foot, 7.6-meter chimney that marked the post office entrance. The initial descent went smoothly, and the group's spirits were high as they explored the cave's magnificent passages, including the ethereal Fountain of Youth and the breathtaking vista from the big room's north overlook. As the day progressed, Steve could see fatigue affecting his group. The constant crawling, climbing, and navigating through tight passages was taking its toll, but they still had a significant portion of the route ahead. Knowing the return trip would require 2.5 hours of demanding caving, Steve decided to push forward toward their planned exit. At the big room's south overlook, Steve discovered someone had cut the fixed bolts that normally provided secure rappelling anchors. Undeterred, he improvised a solution, carefully lowering each team member about 8 feet, 2.4 meters, down to a narrow ledge below using a munter hitch technique. As they approached the next section, Steve noticed something that made his blood run cold. The water level throughout the cave system was dramatically higher than normal, a staggering 35 feet, 10.7 meters, above usual levels. What should have been dry or shallow passages were now filled with dark, frigid water that transformed familiar routes into potentially deadly obstacles. The group encountered thigh-deep water crossing through sections of the big room, the cold liquid seeping through their clothing and sapping their body heat. They successfully navigated the hogback formation, but their optimism was about to be shattered. When they reached Echo Junction, Steve realized they faced a crisis that could trap them underground indefinitely. The bypass route that normally allowed spelunkers to avoid the deepest water was completely submerged, creating a 175-foot, 53-meter, underwater passage through pitch-black, freezing water with no guarantee of air pockets. Of the 7 team members, only 2 possessed fully waterproof headlamps, equipment that was now the difference between life and death in the flooded passages. Without adequate lighting, attempting the swim would be suicidal. In a moment of remarkable courage, Darshan, one of the novices, volunteered to make the treacherous swim. Despite his limited experience, he understood someone needed to cross the passage with a waterproof light to guide the others safely through the submerged route. Steve attached a 70-foot, 21-meter rope to a dry bag buoy, giving Darshan a guideline for the rest of the team to follow. With grim determination, Darshan entered the frigid water and began swimming into the absolute darkness ahead. The 175-foot passage felt endless as Darshan fought against the cold water that drained his strength with every stroke. His breathing became labored as swimming in full caving gear while towing equipment pushed his body beyond its limits. The waterproof headlamp provided only a narrow cone of light in the vast darkness. As Darshan neared what he hoped was the end of the swim, his muscles began to fail. The combination of cold water, physical exhaustion, and psychological stress finally overwhelmed his reserves. Darshan's terrified cry echoed through the water-filled chamber before his strength gave out completely and he disappeared beneath the dark surface, his waterproof light vanishing into the depths. Steve, whose lifeguard training had prepared him for water emergencies, didn't hesitate. He plunged into the icy water, knowing his non-waterproof headlamp would immediately fail, leaving him to navigate by feel alone in pitch-black conditions. When Steve reached Darshan, he found the young man barely conscious, his head bobbing intermittently above the surface as he gasped for air. Panic had completely taken over, and Darshan's survival instincts kicked in with dangerous consequences. He grabbed onto Steve with a death grip, threatening to drag them both under. Fighting against both the brutal cold and Darshan's panicked struggles, Steve used every ounce of strength to push them both toward a steep, muddy bank along the side of the passage. When they reached the bank, Steve realized the true severity of Darshan's condition. The young man showed all the classic signs of severe hypothermia: dilated pupils, slurred and confused speech, unresponsive limbs, and most alarmingly, he had stopped shivering, indicating his core temperature had dropped to dangerously low levels. Steve forced Darshan to eat emergency food supplies to help generate internal heat, while calling to the other team members to keep him alert and responsive. Leaving Darshan in their care, Steve dove back into the flooded passage and swam toward the lake that led to the cave entrance, his own body now suffering from cold exposure. Steve successfully reached the surface and immediately alerted the two novices that remained at camp before running to a nearby landowner's house to call for a cave rescue team. The first rescue team member arrived within 10 minutes, but what followed was a heated argument about whether Steve should stay to guide rescuers or return immediately to provide care for Darshan. Steve's determination won out. Grabbing 200 feet, 61 meters of rescue rope, emergency supplies, warm, dry clothes, and a blanket, he stuffed everything into waterproof bags and prepared for another brutal swim through the flooded passages. 40 minutes after leaving Darshan's side, Steve was back in the flooded chamber. He immediately began field treatment for severe hypothermia, helping Darshan strip out of soaked clothing and drying him off as thoroughly as possible. The warm, dry clothes and emergency food began to show effect, and slowly, Darshan started improving. The rescue operation that followed was a testament to the cave rescue team's skill and dedication. Working in pitch-black conditions with frigid water up to their necks, rescuers carefully maneuvered Darshan across the treacherous lake system using specialized flotation devices and safety lines. The delicate operation took 5 hours to transport Darshan across the various water obstacles and through the complex cave passages to safety. Every movement had to be calculated and controlled to prevent him from being dropped back into the water or suffering additional injuries. The entire rescue operation lasted 11 grueling hours, from the moment Darshan disappeared beneath the water until he was finally brought to the surface. Thanks to Steve's quick thinking, lifeguard training, and absolute refusal to abandon his team member, Darshan survived what could easily have been a fatal case of hypothermia in one of the most challenging rescue environments imaginable. The Sloan Valley Cave Rescue became a case study in how quickly conditions can change in underground environments, and how proper training, quick decision-making, and unwavering determination can mean the difference between life and death when adventure turns to disaster in the depths of the earth.